We're having a conference here in Claremont on the 28th and 29th of October. And this conference is based on some very bad news. Now we're going to try to make the conference itself come out with a little better news. But we think that we as a people, and especially we people in the church, need to recognize that the human activity over the past few centuries and increasingly recently have created a situation in which disaster and catastrophe is inevitable. The civilization that we have created, the global civilization based on economic growth, has overshot. And that whole pattern that biologists are familiar with of a species overshooting is inevitably followed by a collapse. And people have been recognizing for 40 years now. I think 1970 may have been the first time that there was much recognition of this, that our Western society, which has become a global society, has been using resources and polluting at a rate that the natural world simply cannot cope with. And back in 1970, there was a book published called Limits to Growth. And in the first edition of that book, they projected that around 2020, there would be a collapse. Now, in the subsequent editions, they left out the dates because, of course, they don't. Any sort of specific prediction like that is not likely to happen to come out right. But that the general principle that if you keep on polluting more and more, and if you use up the resources more and more, meanwhile the population grows more and more, there comes a time when it just can't continue. The language we usually use is unsustainable. And what is unsustainable, by definition, cannot be sustained. Now, Bill McKibben has written a book, and in that book he explains very clearly the topic that he has specialized on for many years, and that is the topic of how we are changing the context in which we live in such a way that the atmosphere is warming up. And he explains that today we have gone so far that new developments kick in on their own even if we don't continue to produce more and more poisons for the atmosphere. So it's too late to keep that from happening. For example, as global warming leads to the melting of the Arctic ice, more and more the surface of the Earth becomes water. And the water absorbs the heat from the sun, whereas the ice reflects the sunlight back. So even if we stop making it worse, we've already done things that are going to continue to increase the temperature of the planet. Or the tundra is melting, thawing, I should say. And as it thaws, it releases a great deal of methane. Methane is a gas that does more harm in terms of global warming than the gases that are already causing the problem. So we need to face the fact that the bad climate-related problems we've had in the last couple of years are the foretaste of much more serious problems that are going to hit us. Now, the book in 1970 was written without much awareness of weather change. It was simply based upon other problems. So it's not as if we could just solve the problem of global warming by some dramatic technical process, everything would be all right. We need to realize that the time for avoiding catastrophe is past. And that means we need to think about how to make life as good as we can in a time that's going to be much, much more difficult. Now, I'm a churchman, and so I particularly think about the role of the church. And I think that we can predict, really almost as a projection of what is already going on, that as political and economic institutions fail to meet the needs of people, that people turn to the church. It's already true on a very small scale that our political and economic system is not meeting the needs of people for food. And of course, it's not just the Christian churches, but it's groups like that, organized groups that are based upon principles that unite them around the need to meet human needs, that are responding. Their capacities are limited, and if the problem of providing food for the poor is going to become more and more serious, and the state is not going to fill the need, we already need to be thinking about how we can deal with problems that are much more massive than those we've dealt with in the past. But it won't be only food. There are other problems that we'll have to deal with. So our idea is it's time to get people together and think together about what the changes are going to be, not trying to predict in detail what's going to happen when and where, but reflecting about how, as communities, local towns as well as volunteer communities, we can reflect in advance about how to respond as problems of this kind come along and not be taken continually by surprise. It doesn't mean that the things we've been doing are not worth doing. But it mustn't mean simply that we take on an additional set of tasks over and above the others. We have to rethink our priorities. What are the most important things to do in a time when the planet will not be able to support the populations that we now have? So, we have just 2 days in which we will be dealing very intensively with these problems. The night before, that is a Thursday night, I think, in a very large auditorium in the Claremont colleges, Bill McKibben will be giving a public presentation. He has been gaining a lot of attention recently because of his keen concern that if we, instead of making adjustments to use less fossil fuels, we solve our problem of peak oil by exploiting the huge tar sands deposits of Canada, game's up, he says. It won't just be that we have catastrophes to adjust to, it's that the human species won't survive. So he is trying to arouse the people of the United States, and especially to influence the president, not to take this route. He's gotten some attention, and I'm sure that will be very much a topic on his mind when he comes to speak here. But even apart from that, he's written this book to make it clear to us that the future is going to be very different from the past, and that it is time for us to think together. So he will be with us at the conference, responding to what various people are saying. We'll have 4 plenary speeches, and then we'll have breakout groups, about 10 each time. So it's a very rich fair. Almost anyone can find some things of great interest, I think. We'll decide that it's worthwhile to take off a couple of days, the end of October, to come and listen and suggest and propose and share ideas. We think that no matter how bad the news is, if we hear it together in a context of mutual support and try to make plans to respond to it in as positive a way as possible, that it does not need to be devastating. We need to grieve, but we don't need to despair. We'll try to stimulate hope, but realistic hope based upon what the real possibilities may be.